200 episodes. I never would have thought that we would have made it this far, but we have. And tonight, for this special edition of Free Minds TV, we're going to be examining the 5 biggest issues of the day and the 5 best, in our opinion, solutions. That coming up tonight on Free Minds TV.
Episodes. We made it, Nick, and thank you very much to all the viewers for tuning in to a very special edition of Free Minds TV.
That's right. How many shows make it to 200?
Right,
episodes?
And while we don't have a big budget for balloons and cool montage clips, if I will,
could have gotten the noisemaker thing.
That's true. Well, thank you. It's Toby here with you.
And Nick.
And as always, we're going to continue to stir the pot of controversy and challenge you, the viewer, to think outside the box. I wish if I had the time, Nick, between working full-time and going to grad school and doing the radio show and family and personal life, would have made a whole cool montage clip. But, you know, people don't really like those anyway. So why not take a look back, just talk about some of the issues.
It's not going to be any blurry fade to a video montage.
No, but why don't we just talk about some of the themes that we look at, maybe some of the solutions, because week after week we come in here and we rant about stories.
Problems. The world
issues,
is full of problems and bad
falling
stuff.
Apart, the sky is falling.
It is kind of actually falling.
It's very slow. It's like a train wreck that you're watching from a distance and you can see it coming from miles away and it's slowly, it's happening, but it's
like
not.
Charlie Sheen. It's a train
quick.
wreck that's happening slowly.
Sure, yeah.
You can watch it from a distance.
Sure. But this really affects all our lives, so it's important to talk about. And while we are talking about problems all the time, it's also important to talk about issues. So as I thought about this show, I was like, what can we do with the limited amount of time? I don't have really much time to go and do some cool video editing like I would have, say, in episode 50 or something when I had a lot more time on my hands. Now this show doesn't bring in any money. We've been running in the red for a while since the economy went bust. So very busy person. So didn't have that much time. So what can we do that still is on this theme of looking at the issues, but also looking at some of the solutions and still looking back at the last 200 episodes and what we have been talking about. And as I thought about the episodes, a theme came to mind. And over the last week, I've been mulling it over, and the theme has to do with about, I'm sure you could make a huge list of hundreds of problems, but I came up with a core 5 of them. And then, in my opinions, 5 solutions to those problems. And I really think that if we looked at these problems and then looked at some of the solutions to these problems, we really could make real difference and stop this train wreck from being so bad and actually eventually get the train back on the track running at full steam to its destination without a big crash, hurting everybody, you know, doing immoral things, etc., etc. The stuff we talk about week after week. So, if we had a drum roll budget, we would, but no budget. First issue. I'm going to go with the federal government in general. Yes, they have a myriad of problem programs in the federal government, but I've been saying it probably the last 100 episodes or so. I've been getting more and more vehement about the federal government is the problem in the first place. At this point, they're like a big old tick on a dog and sucking the system dry. They're doing much more harm than good. Yes, there are some programs that actually do help a few people. But there are also a lot of big programs that hurt, kill, murder, ruin lives of millions of people, not only in this country, but around the entire globe. So that's my first and biggest issue, Nick, is cutting out the federal government.
And looking beyond the policy that they implement, if you take a look at the structure that the federal government has now taken, if you look at some of the writings of the founders, I know a lot of you don't have time for this, but if you're a history buff or you're into poli-sci stuff, you may have done this. If you take a look at some of the writings of the founders, some of the people who actually framed the U.S. Constitution, one of the biggest concerns at the time was that the government be representational. Of course, they had not had any representation with the British Parliament. They fought a war over that, among other things. Really, they just didn't like paying taxes all that much. It's a more important issue. But what they ended up doing was trying to make that system that was a lot more representative. Now, some of the guidelines that they gave at the time were on the order of 1 representative to every, it depends, you hear different numbers floated around, but every some tens of thousands, 30,000, 50,000, certainly not more than 100,000 citizens, for the government to be really effective at all as a representative body. Well, the country's grown, both in terms of the number of states in the Union and in terms of the number of people. And at this point, if you do the math...
and those being represented, of course.
Right.
Because don't forget, back when the founders created the Constitution, it was only white, rich landowners who were represented. So, I mean, the concept of representation
Maryland was
has
very progressive
drastically
and allowed
changed.
Catholics to run.
Yeah, that was nice of them. But the whole
New Hampshire didn't. If you look at the New Hampshire Constitution, there was an amendment to the process that stopped requiring you be a Protestant to be in the legislature. I think it was 1878.
Wow.
We like to think that it wasn't quite as bad up north, but
it's bad. Governments are, well, you're looking at systems of injustice and racism, and a lot of those are founded in governmental policies. But anyways, you know, we've talked about it over and over again, and a lot of the national stories we talk about come down to this federal government and unchecked control and power. So I say, let's be done with it. What does the federal government do for you that you couldn't do without?
Well, and the other, I want to get back just quickly to the representation thing. Because, you know, to point out, it's, even if you're looking at what Congress does to represent you, you're looking at about one representative for every, well, if just in the House, it's more like 1 in a million, or 500,000 or 600,000 actually. It's a lot less representative than the founders intended. It's just very difficult to get a hold of these people and make them do what you want them to do. Not to mention the fact, Toby, that over the past 200 episodes, we've pointed out time and time again that Congress actually doesn't enact a lot of the legislation, a lot of its regulatory law, but a lot of the stuff that has the force of law that can land you with a fine or prison time, they don't write these laws. Unelected bureaucracies do. I mean, the whole system of checks and balances has fallen apart. Congress ignores the Constitution, but they don't even bother going to Congress to write the laws. And Congress doesn't read most of the laws that they actually enact.
Well, that's the thing. That's where I've been so disenfranchised, Nick. Say a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I might have said one of the solutions is read the Bills Act, write the Laws Act.
We were pushing hard, downsize DC.
And if we have a federal government, that's
they should be
But I'm giving up, Nick. And so I'm saying they're useless, they're unchecked, they're out of control, they do more harm than good, and they rob us of all our wealth. I'm sorry. I can do without the federal government. A lot of those anarchist types out there will say, well, do you want to be free or do you want to be ruled? Let's do away with the entire government. Well, you know what I say? Let's do away with the federal government. Then you kind of 50 little states of government, and all the anarchists can move to one government and get rid of that one, or all the really people who love their big government can go to another state and have that one, and you can actually have real choice instead of one giant central bureaucracy. So, you know what? If we did get rid of the federal government, many little ideas could pop up. The whole idea of having 50 states all together, little laboratories of what works and what doesn't work for governments, I think that's the way to go. And that's how you can
One last thing before we move on. The other thing, I know a lot of you out there not really keen on the idea of secession. Think we're crazy.
Sure, we are crazy.
Might even call us treasonous. I wouldn't say we're treasonous. Maybe seditious, but not treasonous. And one thing I would point out is another option is to have the state governments nullify unconstitutional laws. Things like the healthcare mandate. Most of what the federal government does, it has no constitutional authority to do. The states can just say, we're not going to do that. It's kind of a step in between. Just all those things that you don't have constitutional authority to do, we're just not going to give you money for those things anymore. Here's our prorated check.
All right. Well, moving right along, Nick, and we could harp on the federal government all day.
On each one of these.
But we've got more issues to talk about. A big one, and this really does go right back to the federal government. But you know what? You could see some states. One of the arguments for the federal government is this alone, and that has to do with wars and world domination. Yes, we know best. Our culture is best, and we must spread that culture to the entire world at the great cost and detriment of our country and everybody in it and all the wealth in our country, and we must dominate the world and screw other cultures. Ours is the best, even though we can't get ours right. I say it's time to bring all the troops home and do away with the standing military that's really not helping us. Should states get together, say we did get rid of the federal government, should they get together and have some kind of a treaty to have, say, a navy out there or something to protect us in case someone does to try to sail across those two huge moats on either side of the U.S.? Yeah, probably. I think we could do that without the federal government, though, and we could definitely be a lot safer without spreading all our troops around the entire globe. not to mention the cost of it all.
Yeah, and if you look at a different model for a union, I mean, there was, if you read the...
Well, actually, our model for the union, the one that the U.S. was based on. I'm sorry, I don't know where you're going on this.
No, you don't. See, what I'm saying is there were a lot of, at the time that the federal government was created, there were a lot of problems having a central government as weak as existed under the Articles of Confederation. At this time, with as much history as has elapsed, the U.S., I don't really envision the 50 states ever being too much besides a common market and to some extent a mutual defense association. I don't really envision completely distinct nations. I just think that a lot of this could be addressed, leaving most of the sovereignty to the states by them severally through things like trade agreements. You create a trading bloc. They did it in Europe. You don't need a federal government. They're going towards basically adopting something like the federal government. But you don't need a strong central government. You could just adopt some minimum standards, trade amongst each other. If Mexico decides to spill over the border, and I mean their military, into Texas, then we could send troops to help them. I'm sure that would happen.
Sure.
So I'm just saying that when we say get rid of the federal government, it doesn't mean that necessarily we wouldn't be able to address some of these issues. And there were reasons to adopt the union in the first place. It doesn't mean we couldn't address them differently.
It's a different day and age, Nick. The union was adopted where it took weeks to get a telegram from one side of the country to the other. Now it's instantaneous for everybody out there. So it's a completely different world we live in. I'm not too worried about the Canadians or the Mexicans coming and invading us. And as I said, we do have those big old oceans on either side. I think that, and I think a lot of research points to a fact that spreading ourselves across the entire globe, trying to impose our will on others, on other cultures, does not work to keep us safe. It works for a few corporations out there to make some people very, very wealthy, makes some people very, very powerful, and allows people to dominate other cultures, other countries around the whole globe. What's it do for you and I? Makes us feel guilty, makes us all murderers by proxy because all our tax dollars are going to it. And it brings our soldiers back with post-traumatic stress disorder, brain injuries, and other kinds of issues that are all going to affect everyday work, the families, everyone in society that they will be living with. We don't need it.
No. And unfortunately, over the last, because we're doing a recap here, I mean, we've covered 3 wars. We've covered Afghanistan, we've covered Iraq, and I'm going to say, even though it didn't get that bloody, I'm going to count Libya as a war because we bombed the crap out of them.
Yeah,
so,
someone we talked about that last couple of shows again, and someone did send us some comments saying that, well, there's actually been other little conflicts that weren't really reported on the news too. So
there were some strikes in Somalia. Yeah. Those are interventions. I'm not going to go and call them an all-out war, but
it's our military spreading across the globe.
The U.S. Air Force creams in other countries' armed forces, and then the CIA decides to help a rebel faction. I'm going to call that getting involved in a war.
Sure. I say we don't need any involvement. We'd be a lot better off.
2 invasions and 1 non-invading war.
Leave them be if you want to send your hard-earned money, not my tax dollars, not my hard-earned money. If you want to send your hard-earned money to, say, the Libyan rebels, by all means, I think we should make that legal.
Boston used to be a heck of a fundraising point for the IRA, and I'm not saying that I liked what they did, but that was a guerrilla army. They raised plenty of money here in the U.S., and they got a lot of weapons and training from the U.S., too. So I have no problem with private citizens wanting to support a rebel faction.
Sure.
And you
want to go throw on a bike helmet and go to Iraq and run around in the sand?
Give them some money, send them some bullets, send them some AKs.
Go for it. But not my money, not my bullets.
Yeah.
I'll keep those for myself right here. I don't need them in lands far away that I didn't hear about until we went to war with them. I'm sorry. So leave the dragons where they be in their caves. We'll worry about our own demons over here. All right. So we got in a couple of issues, the federal government and, of course, the wars and dominations. I think that the biggest issue we have here at home, one of the biggest anyways, the ones that impose on the freedoms, the rights of everybody, lock up millions and millions of our citizens, cost us billions and if not trillions of dollars over time. It's the war on drugs and the war on other vice crimes. This has gotten ridiculous. The United States, and as we've said, probably on, 20 of the last 200 shows we've quoted this number, has more prisoners than any other country in the world, despite that its population is much smaller than many other countries, arguably much less free countries such as China. 1.5 billion people, only 1.5 million of its citizens behind bars. United States, about 300 million people and change. Over 2 million people behind bars, not to mention a whole litany of other millions on probation, waiting to go to trial, or some other kind of tie-up with the system, or they're a felon, they can't own a gun. You get into it, it's millions upon millions upon millions, and these systems are based on racism, classism, and other systems of power and privilege that are completely backwards, and if you really examine them, make you feel guilty that your tax dollars are going to fund these systems.
Yeah, and they're not very effective at keeping us safe or alleviating social ills either. I mean, when you're
they have a detrimental effect in many cases.
Right. I mean, the war on drugs is not an effective deterrent to drug use. It's been going on for decades now. Drug usage rates haven't been smashed. In many ways, the drug problem has gotten worse. In many ways, because of prohibition, we've seen drugs like crack cocaine and methamphetamine become a lot more prevalent, and I don't believe we would see those things arising, just as we didn't see as much hard liquor consumption in the U.S., Toby, before alcohol prohibition was put into place. And probably more than any other theme on this show, I think we've made the argument that drug prohibition of narcotics that are currently illegal, has been no more successful, and it makes no more sense to continue it than alcohol prohibition did. I'm sorry, it just doesn't work. It's got lots of unintended consequences, and it robs us of a great deal of our liberty. I mean, beyond maybe our current tax system, which says that the government can take as much of your income as they want, it's kind of part and parcel. I'd say they're both on the same level. Saying you don't actually have a right to any of your own labor if the government says you don't, and saying that you don't have a right as an adult to put substances into your body that they might not want you to put into your body. I don't get it.
Yeah, education is the way to go. You educate people on the dangers and let the free people make their own decision. Tell people the harm for putting things in your body, just like eating Big Macs every day, not a healthy way to live. Drinking large amounts of alcohol, smoking cigarettes, or using illicit drugs, not healthy. I think there's much better ways. People want more info on this. Go back in the archives, or leap.cc, I think it is, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. They have some excellent arguments about it.
And for the Republican types out there who might not agree with us, I just wanted to make the quick point, because I was reading Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations again, and it's kind of the foundation of free market thinking. Not that a lot of you Republicans are too good at that, but if you consider yourself a Republican or a conservative, one of the ones who isn't principled enough to see the difference between the way things are enacted by those people and those actual principles at work, I just want to make the point that the whole basis of the idea of having a free market society, a society where people have a right to property, is the idea that people, number one, own their own bodies, number two, own their labor. That's the source of wealth, and therefore own the fruits of their labor, whatever it is, coin, food, whatever it is you get in payment. So if you don't own yourself, you have no right to your labor and no right to the fruits of your labor. Ooh. So if you're somebody,
gotta have all three.
Right. I mean, they flow. These things are consequential. You don't get to a right to property without those other two.
Sure.
And
well, we've lost.
What are you thinking? I mean, just reconcile that, because if you're somebody who takes a free market economic stance, except for when it comes to lifestyle choices like the war on drugs, well, if people don't own their own bodies, they really don't own their own property, do they?
Yeah. And anyways, we could go on for many shows about this, and we have, so go back in the archives. But we do need to move on. One thing that having all this war on created crimes, vice crimes, crimes that aren't hurting anyone except the individual who's committing those crimes, and you could argue society as a whole, but a lot of the unintended consequences are much, much worse. And as we've stated, this is an individual society where the individual is free. It's not collective. But anyways, moving right along, law enforcement officers instead of peace officers. There's been a dramatic shift where police officers are no longer looking to keep the peace and keep people safe. Instead, they're going out and looking for crimes to arrest them. Fishing expeditions, little things to look for, I don't know, the drugs in the car to confiscate the car, et cetera, that are filling up our prisons, costing tons of money on the enforcement as well as the prosecution side.
Not to mention
it's ridiculous.
Prostitution, gambling.
Sure. All the vice crimes.
All the victimless crimes.
Yeah.
And
get rid of them.
That's part of it. That is a big part of it. And I just think the other thing that we've seen since September 11th is it's being done in the name of maybe we'll catch a terrorist, or we need to do anything in the name of safety. And the point I would make to that is that they had excellent law enforcement officers in East Germany. They have excellent law enforcement officers in most countries in the world. China, Russia, Mexico. Well, Mexico, they're pretty corrupt, but they're pretty good.
They're good at their corruption.
They're good at arresting people. They're good at cracking down. And in a lot of those countries you would think of as being very unfree, very unpleasant places to live, they don't have a huge problem with crime. Yes, fascism really does. Right. I mean, you got a good chance of Mexico. That's a different issue. But
that's a war on drugs issue.
But a lot of, you'll agree that a lot of really strict regimes don't have a huge problem with criminal elements. But that's because they just kill the criminals along with everybody else. And that's where these things go. It'd be much better to get back to peace officers, not law enforcement officers.
Problem number 5, taxes. It's a huge one, Nick. The way that services are rendered in this country is ridiculous. We are getting to the point where many statistics quote that over 50% of the jobs out there are either directly related to the government or by proxy related to government contracts. That is a whole lot of numbers of people counting on the government and other people supporting them. We need to fundamentally change the way we're looking at services, Nick. We could do a lot of services that are necessary. We've talked about a lot of the services the government puts out are necessary services that could be done in the private sector and have been done many times in the private sector, but they're done inefficiently. And the way taxes are collected is wrong. The way, I mean, it's
well, yeah, I mean,
a tax issue.
You don't have a choice in whether you pay taxes. Taxation is morally equivalent to theft.
Yeah.
You don't have a choice. Somebody with a gun says, give me your money so I can spend it on other things.
Yeah, at least be honest about that. If you're someone who's collecting taxes and is, yay, taxes, I'm a socialist. Okay, but be honest about it. Admit it. Admit that you are forcibly taking money from other people who may not want to give it up. Admit that. Admit the gun in the room with every law. That's all I'm asking for. Be honest with yourself.
Lysander Spooner, basically a free market anarchist, individualist anarchist thinker, actually put it that there's not much difference between a highwayman, just a regular robber, and the government, except that the common thief doesn't follow you around after they pull a pistol and say your money or your life and pretend to be doing it for your own good. Okay. Government does.
Yeah.
So you can at least, once the highwayman has taken what you have at that moment, he leaves you alone. Government, they rob you, tell you it's for your own good, and then follow you around until they feel like robbing you again.
Yep.
That's the distinction. And a lot of these services are very useful. Things like education, healthcare, up until somewhat more recently, healthcare was at least somewhat private in the U.S. It looks like it's going the other way, but I mean, these things they're very valuable. Somewhat, yeah. Some, these are all very, very valuable services, but they're kind of too valuable to leave up to the government. Plus, I thought the Soviet Union was supposed to have lost the Cold War, and it seems to me that if
they just moved it over here.
If you have a country where over half the jobs or economic activity are the result of government programs and spending, that's a lot closer to a communist country than a free country.
True.
I thought the communists lost.
Well, it's changed their face. All right, Nick. Troubles.
They're us now.
We're supposed to be talking about the top 5 problems and then 5 solutions. And as with a lot of shows we've done, the first more than half of the show, 3/4 of the show has been devoted to problems. We have less than 4 minutes to come up with our 5 solutions. So luckily, we've already been going over a lot of them.
Well, we mentioned get rid of the federal government. That was
first one. Number 1, get rid of the federal government. Man, that'll really open up the debate for what we can do. Sure. All right, next one. How do we get there? How do you really free a state? How about the Free State Project in New Hampshire? We've talked about this a lot, and I still think that with the federal government, it's your best chance for reducing the size of government, getting back to freedom, collectively gathering freedom-like people together into one state.
Right. I mean, you've just got more leverage if you've got the concentration.
Sure. We're halfway to our number here in New Hampshire. We're not members, but we're New Hampshire natives. But there's 10,000 people signed up, less than 1,000 in the state of New Hampshire already, and having big effects to preserve liberty, freedom, and reduce the size of government. Learn more at freestateproject.org. All right, next one. Next big thing that we think could be a solution, and that's, we've talked about it a lot, jury nullification. Fully informed juries.
Yeah. And this is a very direct approach. This is a direct action approach. You don't necessarily have to repeal all of these bad laws on, say, things like victimless crimes. And just point out, if there is a victim, in my opinion, there was a crime of some kind.
Sure.
We don't always address those things in the right way. Property crimes, at least for things like first offenses or relatively petty crimes, I think we're far better off doing things like restitution than the throw the book at them incarceration approach that we have right now. Not saying that you should never go to prison
Restorative
for stealing,
justice programs, those kinds of things, concentrating on them.
Right. But with the bad laws, the laws that are prosecuting people for just being free and living their lives, you can nullify. I mean, juries did this during Prohibition. Now, some judges, I'm not giving legal advice here. Some judges will tell you you have to judge many of them will tell you, you have to judge the case based on the facts presented, not the merits of the law itself. However, there's a long tradition of jury nullification, as long as there's been a trial by jury system, in ways that's why it was written into the Magna Carta, which was the forebearer of all limited constitutional government. Of course, it was only the nobles with that, but that was the idea that there was a final check on the king or on the state, and that was a jury of your peers who had the power to decide whether or not to find you guilty.
Sure.
And there's been a long tradition of them judging the law as well as the facts.
You want to learn more about that? I suggest fija.org. And we did mention the war on drugs, and I wanted to repeat leap.cc, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, I think is a good one if you don't really get the whole legalize prohibition, get rid of prohibition on the war on drugs, stop the war on drugs, leap.cc. All right, got a couple more solutions. We already mentioned it. We have law enforcement officers instead of peace officers. Let's somehow, you were mentioning this isn't really a solution type thing or an issue that we can put in, but I think returning to peace officers would be a good idea.
Law enforcement officers instead of peace officers.
Yeah, I like that idea. I like going back.
No, well, that's law enforcement instead of peace officers, so bad. But the solution was return to peace officers.
Yeah, how do we get there? That's kind of convoluted. I'm not really
These other steps might get us to a place where we could get that kind of legislation passed. Doing away with things like the war on drugs or other vice crimes would go a long way towards this. Gets rid of some of the jackboot mentality.
Sure. Final solution, Nick, and I think that this is a big one. This is where it really matters. And this is the one that's lost most of the time. And that's getting out of centralization and counting on government and counting on the community, to your neighbors, turning to your neighbors, protecting your neighbors, watching out for your neighbors, donating to charity, giving what you can, helping the old lady down the block shovel her driveway in the snow. I'm guilty of not doing this all the time. We need to start coming together and helping each other out, or else these times they're going to eat us all alive, folks. We got to do something. And I say, counting on your neighbors, turning to community, not counting on the government for everything is the way to go.
That's what we have to do. It's what we did before we had a big behemoth government. That's what you do.
Yeah, and that's how people are getting...
It takes some work.
Yeah, this is how people are getting through these tough times. Why not take that to the next level? Rethink the way we have to fund important things. Turn to community. See what the individual community needs, not what the federal government needs, what your individual community needs. That's what matters. You have different thoughts, visit freemindstv.com, and we'd love to hear your solutions, problems. It'd be great to hear that. Until next week, though, with episode 201, we will return. It's been Toby here with you.
And Nick.
Have an excellent night, weekend, or whenever you're watching this. Have a good one.